All right, thanks so much for coming, folks. Thank you to the people on the live stream. Are we live streaming? Thank you to the people on the live stream. Thank you. So we're here to talk about monitoring and evaluation, boosting your project's impact. So I wanted to start a little bit to talk about myself, kind of how I got into monitoring and evaluation, kind of where I fit into this. So I am the co-founder of Fish Welfare Initiative, and I've been worrying about how to measure our impact for around 1.5 years now. But that being said, I'm 100% not an expert in monitoring and evaluation, which is a little bit of a weird way to start a talk on monitoring and evaluation. But I think the best way to think about me, essentially, is kind of an intrepid adventurer, if you like, that has gone into the monitoring and evaluation community in the world, seen some of the tools that they have, some of the systems they have for helping us to evaluate our impact. And I want to share with you where we've learned, kind of how we've implemented that at Fish Welfare Initiative, and potentially how you could implement it too. So what are we going to talk about? What is monitoring and evaluation? Is a good place to start. How can you actually use it in your project? Why you should even care in the first place is a very valid question. The long-term potential, if you allow me to get a little airy-fairy, that I see for the movement, doing monitoring and evaluation, and if that's a little too much, then what you can actually do right now to implement these ideas into your project. So we'll start with the first one. What is monitoring and evaluation? Well, the definition is relatively simple. It is monitoring and evaluation, right? What it says on the tin. So monitoring and evaluation, the monitoring aspect, we're talking about systematic and routine collection of information from projects and programs. Basically, we're talking about collecting useful data. That's what that summarizes to. And evaluation, assessing as systematically and objectively as possible a project or a program. Basically, looking at that information and then evaluating it, seeing if it's aligning with your expectations. You notice I've highlighted a few words there, right? Systematic, routine, objective. And I'm trying to get at here the monitoring and evaluation isn't just about kind of the practice of doing this, but it's also about the community, the international community that's built around these ideas. And they've built a code of practice, systems for actually doing this in a systematic, routine, and objective way. And I think that's kind of where the value potentially lies for the animal movement. And the goals of monitoring and evaluation are essentially to think through your project systematically, to capture the lessons from your experience as you're running through your program, and then to assess the overall success of your program as well. Ultimately, it's about kind of capturing lessons learned and building foundational knowledge for your future impact, which seems pretty important. But that's all very kind of like high level and completely understandable if you're asking at this point, like, what even should I monitor, though, and how do I actually evaluate it, right? As I say, kind of like the useful information is in these details. But before I kind of get into that, I do also just want to point out that I think success in monitoring and evaluation very often is in the pre-planning stage. So it's definitely possible to do monitoring and evaluation as the project is running. I'd encourage you to consider that if you have a project that's running. But really, it's done best before the project starts as kind of like a preparatory phase and something that you're thinking about at each stage, monitoring and evaluating your impact. So there are different types of monitoring and evaluation. There's a lot of different ways that we can break down M&E. You can break it down based on like the type of project that you're running. So like direct impact projects might maybe need a different type of monitoring and evaluation to, say, behavioral change or meta projects. Similarly, depending on who you are and what your purposes are, you might need a different kind of monitoring and evaluation. Say you're a funder, that might require a different type of M&E to a practitioner. But the breakdown I have on the right for you guys here is essentially kind of broken down into different sections of your project, like different stages that you might be in. The top one there being concept design, very early stage, right? Like, what are we actually going to do? So here we're asking, what are the goals of our project? What are the needs for the animals that we're trying to address? Or if you're working on a more meta project, what are the needs of the animal movement that we're trying to address? And what does the literature say about how successful this is, how people have done this in the past, blah, blah, blah. Process evaluation, here we're going a step forward and we're looking about actually implementing step by step Like, is it successful? Are we implementing everything that we're trying to do there? So questions like, are the planned activities being realized, and are they being realized efficiently? We'll get a little bit more into what that means. Outcome monitoring, here we're talking about, did the expected outcomes actually happen? And impact assessment, we're talking about, did the outcomes that we actually achieve work towards our goal, which for us is either reducing the suffering of existing animals or stopping existing animals, suffering animals from existing in the first place. I'm going to focus mostly on those two in the middle, because I think that's probably where most people in the room are in terms of their projects. But if you're interested in the other ones, you can come talk to me. I'm also interested in them. Would love to talk to you about it. So with those middle two in mind, we kind of have a very classic structure that a lot of monitoring and evaluation advice will give. Like, if you boil it all down, what does it come to? Basically, these 5 steps. Number 1, outline a theory of change. A theory of change is essentially just a step-by-step, right? You go from the activities that you're doing and the inputs you're giving all the way up to the actual impact that you want to see. And you tell a story of that through line, right? So every little step that happens from you doing stuff to animals actually having better lives. We'll see an example in a minute. Identifying key metrics, things that we actually care to assess, say they're assumptions, say they're risks, say they're questions that can help us to evaluate our impact along that line. We identify those, and then we find ways to measure those key metrics, right? Again, we'll get into an example in a minute. Collecting data then, so like step 1 to 3 is almost kind of like the pre-planning stage, and then step number 4 is like the actual doing it, collecting that data. And then step 5 is kind of like combining the previous steps, looking at the plan that we had, the kind of expectations that we had going into the project and the assumptions we were making against the data that we collected and seeing if those things line up. So very high level. Let's get into an example. So made up project, humane education, right? Just imagine we're doing this, I don't know, for like university students, say age 20 upwards. And we're trying to educate them on animal welfare issues, maybe animal rights issues as well. So starting with the first step, the theory of change. Theories of change typically break down into these steps, right? So we have activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. The activities are essentially just the things that you actually do. So this can be, it's sometimes called inputs/activities. So like, you hire the staff, in fact, I have my example right here, I can show you. Train ambassadors to give the talks in the humane education example, identifying the schools that we're actually going to talk at, making a presentation on animal protection, and then the actual ability to travel to the schools. Those are examples of like activities and inputs that we might have for this project. Then we move into outputs. What are outputs? Outputs are essentially just kind of the deliverables of the project that you're trying to achieve. The schools actually want you to give a talk is like a very obvious step in this process. Ambassadors go to the schools and they give presentations, right? So those are our deliverables. We're then moving from outputs into outcomes, and you can see outcomes are broken into immediate and delayed. So the immediate outcomes from this might be things like students hearing the presentation, students actually feeling more compassionate towards animals as a consequence of that talk, and then students becoming more aware of animal protection issues as a whole. But as we move from immediate to delayed outcomes, right, now we're looking at kind of like maybe more the deliverables that we really care about, things like the students increasing their likelihood of purchasing more plant-based products, purchasing less animal products, and supporting animal protection stuff projects. The impact then, so the outcomes then, these are kind of like the things that we're measuring, right, our objectives. But the impact is what we actually care about, which is that animals suffer less, assuming that's what we all care about in this room. There we go, very rough theory of change, just a sketch, but that's what that could potentially look like. Then we're looking at the key metrics, right? So like, we kind of have in our head, okay, this is the step-by-step process that we see to impact, but like, what do we actually care to measure along that method? And I've kind of broken key metrics down into like assumptions, indicators of change, info on important questions. So assumptions, well, in fact, let's just see some examples. So between the activities and the outputs, right? So the activities are the things that we do, and the outputs are the deliverables that we get from that. For this example, we might think that schools actually accept the request to speak, right? That's an example. Activities outputs as well, we might have that we can actually find good ambassadors who can give this talk. From the outputs to the outcomes, so this is from the deliverables to kind of like the actual objectives that we had, we might think that students need to attend. That's quite important. Students actually listen. The presentation is actually compelling. As we're moving from like those immediate outcomes into the delayed ones, we're looking at students actually retaining that information, students translating that compulsion into action. And then from the outcomes into the impact, so this is from like changing their spending behavior and supporting more animal projects to actual impact for animals. We might have like, here's a potential key question, like how many animals does this actually affect? And we might consider things like, an assumption that we believe that it is better overall for animals to not exist than to be in factory farming. Like, probably not a controversial statement in this room, I think. And that can kind of highlight how maybe not every question is born equally. But here we can get a sense of like, these are assumptions that we can find good ambassadors. Here we have like students listen. That's kind of like an indicator of change. And we have like questions like, well, how many animals are we actually affecting? Or like, how long does this impact actually last? So those are our key metrics. Next step, measurement plan, right? So we know kind of what we're doing. We know kind of the assumptions that we're making along the road. Okay, but like, what can we actually do to measure those assumptions, right? So pull that back up. The unfortunate reality is there's loads of different things that you can do to measure these things, right? And this is kind of like getting beyond the scope of what I can talk about. I'm not an expert in humane education. And hopefully kind of when you're at this point, you can also talk to somebody who knows kind of that specific type of monitoring and evaluation. Say, in this example, working on human behavior change, and see if they have like specifics for how you can measure these things. But we could do like A/B testing. We could look at students listening and presentation is compelling through click-through rates. We have qualitative focus groups, qualitative comparative analysis, controlled experiments. Lots of fancy names for various things that are sometimes simple and sometimes not. Some of these are really heavy touch, like, oh my gosh, a controlled experiment would be a lot of work. Some of them are pretty light touch, like looking at the click-through rate of a unique URL. That's fairly easy to do. I wanted to just focus, though, real quick on like one of these. Let's just take literally the first one here. Schools accept the request to speak, right? And I've suggested A/B testing as a potential thing you could do here. What is A/B testing? Like very simply, layman's. It's taking like a group, like a small group. In this case, it would be schools, and kind of like testing two different types of, in this case, it would be ways of reaching out to them and seeing which one works better, basically. And so in this example, like let's say, for example, we have the question, is it better to approach people with a professional email, or is it better to have more of a passionate email when we're approaching these universities, right? Valid question to have. Well, we might be able to use A/B testing to dissect this key metric, right? So let's say we get like 5 schools over here, 5 schools, well, preferably in the same place, and we send them like 2 different types of emails, right? So one, we send them more professional, one, we send them more passionate. It might even be somewhere we're not even interested in working. We just want to see what the response rate is to these emails. And we might have some questions, right? So we can kind of break down this one key metric into its own little steps, which is very fun. Everything's like breaking down now. So not opening the email, right? Maybe the problem is that people just don't even open the email we send them. Well, we can download software to track whether that's happening or not, right? We can look at maybe they are opening it, but they're not actually reading it. Well, maybe, again, we can put kind of a unique URL in the email somewhere, and we can see if people are clicking through, and that can be an indicator of whether they are actually reading the email or not. We might think that they are reading it, but they just aren't that interested. That's possible. In which case, maybe we'll look at the response rate, and we can see, how many people are actually replying, and that can be an indicator. And interested, but something falls through. So, it could be that they are interested in having this talk, but somewhere between them reading it and being interested and us actually being there giving our humane education talk, something breaks through. Here we might look at kind of a quantitative and a qualitative assessment. So basically we can talk to our staff, get a sense of what they think is the reasons that this is breaking down, and kind of build a system of maybe a survey or something like that could help us address that one. So there's an example, right? We can do that for every single step of the key metrics that are on here. And that's very kind of broad strokes what the planning looks like. Then we kind of consider that this is more of a cyclical approach, right? So the planning is the first stage, but we also need to actually do and then review. So we have kind of this cycle of plan, do, review. The idea is that we kind of build our theory of change. We look at what our assumptions are. We look at the key metrics, and then we think about how can we measure those key metrics. That's our planning stage. Then we actually go out and we do that. We try it. We measure them. We see how that goes. And then we come back to a formal review stage, right? We think, OK, how did that go? And how did what we saw line up with the assumptions that we made as to why we were going to have an impact, right? Plan, do, review. All right, I want to talk very quickly about how FWI actually applies these ideas in our work. So our very broad theory of change is that we want to work with institutions, and right now we're not even sure what institutions those are. Those could be corporate institutions, those could be governmental institutions. And we want those institutions to influence farmers. We want those farmers to then implement welfare improvements, and then we want, obviously, those welfare improvements to actually improve the lives of fish. So we're kind of at different stages with each one of these in that overall process that I just outlined. So with, for example, institutions, we have theories of changes running for government and corporate work, and we're testing those out right now. So they're kind of in the do stage, if you like. With the farmers and the welfare improvements, we're more in kind of even before the plan, do, review, we're more in project concept development, and we're trying to kind of figure out what the best methods are. Right now, we're just implementing something, but we kind of need to do a lot more upfront work to see how we can engage farmers to do welfare improvements and farmer behavior change. And then we have welfare improvements to improve the lives of fish. This is where I come in. This is what I spend all my time doing, creating version 2 of our welfare standard. So here we're kind of in the review stage. We've already been doing this for a while, and we found, we think that we can have a bigger impact. And so we're kind of in the review and moving, hopefully, back into the planning stage. Why should you care, right? I've just talked at you for quite some time. Reasonable question to be asking. And I think that it kind of breaks down roughly into reasons why you should care for yourself, for your own impact in your own project, and also reasons why you should care for the animal movement as a whole as well about these things. And that's where I'll start to get a bit airy-fairy. So for your project specifically, it helps you to identify improvements in your project that you can make, and it helps you to have a clearer sense of your success, right? So if you really go through this kind of systematic process of looking at every single stage, every single step along your theory of change and evaluating that and thinking how do I know this is actually happening? What can I do to measure whether this is happening? Then you can really start to get a sense of what are the main assumptions I'm making? How can I answer those? Or how are they really hard to answer and I'm just not going to be able to? And it gives you much more of a clearer sense as to what you're trying to do, ultimately with our goal being to impact the world positively, especially for animals. Then having kind of that written down in a systematic and very concise, clear way is a useful thing to have both for external communication, but I think even more so just for yourself to understand your project. And I think since doing this and implementing some of this at Fish Welfare Initiative, it's helped me to go from kind of having this kind of big ball of anxiety that kind of follows me around. I'm oh, I don't know if this actually works. I have this really big assumption that I'm making here. And what about this other idea? And kind of having these written down in a systematic process helps me to kind of then think, OK, I know that I will review these things in due course, and I know that what I'm doing right now fits into a plan for actually getting to a point where I can answer those big questions that keep us all up at night. For the actual whole movement, though, I think that there's reasons why we should be considering this on a broader scale. Ultimately, without monitoring and evaluation, I think that we are kind of in the dark as an animal movement. if we don't try to understand kind of the causal chains of what we're trying to impact, then we're going to continue to be a movement that is very under-researched and does not have a lot of evidence for what we're actually trying to do, right? So there's some really exciting work happening in the corporate campaigns world right now where we're starting to really illuminate that and look a little bit more deeply about what are kind of the assumptions that we're making there, what are the impacts that we can achieve. Now that's something that I hope that we can do for more things as well. I think we're a young movement, and the chances are that we can build foundational knowledge at this stage that can pay dividends in the future as to how to achieve our goals, both helping animals in the short term and in the long term. But I'm going to get back to that because I like to talk about that. But I also kind of wanted to talk a little bit about maybe some of the buts that you have in your head, right? We can talk a bit about this in the Q&A as well, but I wanted to kind of address some of them up front to get the ball rolling on this. But my project is really hard to measure. It's probably true for quite a few of you, right? And that's a very valid point, right? I think some projects are harder to measure than others. That's just unfortunately the case, especially if you have long feedback loops or your impacts are kind of dispersed across multiple different improvements rather than just a single. For us, it's just, we help the fish on the farm. Not everyone's like that. And I think that's a very valid point. But what I would say is that these concepts can apply to your project. And ultimately, understanding it as well as we can, I think, is both something that we can put effort into and that we probably should. And even if it's really hard to measure things and all we can really do is understand what we can't measure and have that written out in a systematic process, then we're at least kind of acknowledging these things and learning how to kind of move on with them or how they should affect how we think about that project, right? I don't have time, but I don't have time. Another very valid point, right? We're all very busy people, I'm sure, and we are taken up on the day-to-day practice of what we want to do so much that it's hard to find time for these kinds of things. Two things I'd say to that. Number one, I think that M&E doesn't have to be as laborious as what I just showed you necessarily. You can kind of tailor it to the allowances that you have, right, as an organization or as an individual. Even if, again, you are just to kind of draw out that theory of change and say, here are the things that I would measure if I had more resources, I think that's still a good step towards you understanding your project and other people being able to understand your project as well. Other thing I would say, though, is that monitoring and evaluation, right? Really looking at whether you're achieving the impacts that you're trying to and whether the assumptions that you're making are following through. It's probably one of the most fundamental things for you to understand whether you're achieving your goal of making the world better for animals. So I think it's worth considering whether it's something that you could make time for. And I think it's still an experiment, right? Looking into processes this systematic is not something that I've done much of in the past, and I think that we're still kind of experimenting with it, but the potential payoff for this, I think, is quite high. So it's worth considering whether you can make time for it, I think. But I'm already doing this stuff. Fantastic. I'm really excited to talk to you if that's true. Yeah, I think there's something to be said for the systematic process, right? A lot of this was intuitive, right? Maybe you're already running a humane education project. Maybe you're already doing the kind of A/B testing thing, right? It's not revolutionary necessarily. I do think there's something to be said for a systematic process that helps you go through that, both for communicating what you're doing to other people and making sure that you're not missing things. As I said before, this ball of anxiety that kind of warbles around us all the time, it can be hard to keep all the things that you have to think about in your head at any given point. But maybe you're already doing a systematic process. If you are, then that's absolutely fantastic. I'm really excited to hear that, and I think that I'd encourage you to share that with the rest of the movement. I think that there is monitoring and evaluation work going on. Of course there is, right? We care about our impact. We care about looking into how to measure our impact. And so this is not absolutely revolutionary as a concept. And if we share what we're doing and how we're doing that with each other, then we can get a better sense as to, what I can steal from you, what you can steal from me, and we can kind of grow more, I think, if we talk about this as an explicit part of what our movement is about and what we do on a day-to-day. All right, now I'm going to kind of get grandiose for a second. What could this actually mean for the movement? I think there's an analogy to be drawn here somewhat with the global health and development movement. Now, the global health and development movement, very similar to ours, it has some people who are trying to achieve short-term impact, right? People who are just like, I just want to help these specific kids improve on education, right? I think that's really important. And then there are other people who are interested in like a broad social movement. They're like, no, we need to end poverty, or we need to, stop inequalities in kind of like these systematic processes that run. And I think what has happened in the monitoring and evaluation space is that both of these groups have been able to implement some of these concepts to help improve their ability to achieve their own goals, right? Take us back like 30 years ago, and to get funding in the global health and development space, you needed basically just a good argument, right? So I might come up to a funder and I say, look, handing out resources to schools is like a really important part of making education better for children, right? If they have more access to like resources like textbooks and notepads and things like that, then we can get these kids to like retain more of what they're learning, and that will ultimately improve learning objectives, right? And that's a plausible argument. It's hard to assess that just from the outset with our intuition, right? But the fact of the matter is that that's not an effective way to improve education. As kind of paradoxical as that might seem, as unintuitive as that might seem, something like deworming tablets that help children to like not have to fight worms whilst they're trying to go to school actually like way better increase education and retention of education information for children, right? In that same way, I think we as a movement, because we have so little resources to tell us as to, what is worth doing, what's the impact of what applies in what context, and what are the limits of different theories of change, we're kind of in the dark in the same way. And right now, all we have is strong arguments. Now, I think to a degree, especially when we're thinking about ourselves as a social movement, it's really hard to get good data on that, right? But thinking about this intentionally and pushing towards that is a foundational part of us growing as a movement past this kind of like young exploratory stage that we're in right now, and towards something where we can actually start to see our goals achieved, or at least that's what I think. So I think it could mean a lot for the movement, potentially. As I say, it's still an experiment, but I think it's an exciting one. All right. Yeah, that's my kind of like grandiose lecture over. What can I actually do right now? Well, you can talk to me about this. I'm extremely excited, if you can't tell, about monitoring and evaluation. I'm excited to talk to you if you're interested in implementing these ideas. If you have questions about it, maybe we can talk about that. And I'm also potentially interested, even if those groups interested in setting up a working group where we could discuss this quite frequently and maybe get some people who know monitoring and evaluation are from that international community involved. You can try an M&E consultant, so I can help you find somebody if you want, and like it will cost money, but it could pay dividends. And if you try it and it doesn't work for you, that's great, because we just learned something, and you can tell everyone else, hey, nah, Tom's completely wrong on this one, ignore him. Great, we can learn from that. There's also a few things that I would suggest to read. So socialimpactnavigator.org, if you type that into Google, that's a really nice resource that just takes you through kind of like the similar steps that I've gone through, why that might be something that you want to do. If you type into Google theory of change in 10 steps, you'll get a report by, I think it's like NRC or something like that, that takes you through how to make a theory of change. And if you type in monitoring and evaluation planning series, you'll get something from a group called INTRAC, INTRAC, which is another kind of, it's much bigger, like that's for the people who want to read a lot, but it gives you like a much more comprehensive assessment of like what monitoring and evaluation contains. Final thing, also want to plug some stuff for FWI whilst I'm here. We're actually looking for an M&E consultant, putting our money where our mouth is. We already have one. We're looking to get someone who can help us with more specifics around running in-field tests where we're looking at like an activity that we want to evaluate. If you know anyone, if you are someone who could help us with that, I would be very happy to talk to you. We're also looking for an international generalist, someone who can join the international team. This will be a job where you go to India, you kind of work with us on the in-field tests that we're running, looking at our theory of change and helping us to actually implement that. So if you're excited about that, come and talk to me, or you can look that up on the website as well. We have a job ad up. We're also looking for an associate director in India. So you do need to be from India for that job. But if you are from India or know anyone who is in the movement and is from India and you think they'd be good for that, let me know. And thank you. Yeah, that's the talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We actually have some time for the Q&A session, so please go to the Eventory app and add your questions in the appropriate section. We have some questions already. First one is, if you find out that a given intervention or activity is not effective, based on M&E, how do you communicate it to other organizations so that they don't feel like they're being patronized?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to know is that I think it's hard to say a project is not effective, right? Like, we have to consider the context that we applied it in, how we applied it, and what the objectives actually were, like what our goals were. So it's not necessarily clear that we can, from one case study, say this is not worth doing, and I think that would be too reductivist. Now, what I would suggest in terms of how we communicate this is FWI will be implementing a report at the end of each year where we kind of outline, here's the theory of change or the theories of change that we were running that year. These were the things that we were measuring along those theories of change, and here's what we learned about them. That, I think, is something that would be really cool to see from more groups, like a report like that, where they kind of outline, what were the challenges that we had implementing this theory of change. And I think we can do that in a way where it's talking more about kind of our project and not necessarily pushing that onto other projects that might be similar. Because ultimately, as I say, I think the context is really important when it comes to impact and how effective projects are.
Thank you. What are some of the immediate and delayed outcomes that you are testing for FWI?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so in FWI, we tend to be a little bit more kind of focused on direct improvements. So our focus is more on the short feedback loop of being able to see improvements on the farm. Now, the main impact that we are trying to have right now is on dissolved oxygen. Just a weird concept, but for fish, it's really important that you have enough oxygen in the water for them to actually breathe and survive. So DO, or oxygen, does not dissolve into water as easily as it passes through air. It's a big problem, especially when there's high stocking densities. That's kind of the major welfare issue that we saw through our needs assessment. And so we are trying to measure that and see how we can improve that. We definitely do have longer-term objectives, we want to help define what the Indian aquaculture looks like. But that's still kind of something that we're building through kind of the institutional change we're looking at. And so I think we're still at an early stage in terms of having measurables there.
Okay. Do you think that there is a minimum, maximum, or optimal number of metrics for a project? Can having too many of them risk being limiting and rigid?
Interesting. Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily that there can be too many. I mean, there can be definitely too many to be practical. But I think it's about the framing that we have, right? Metrics and indicators are exactly that. They're indicators. They're not be-all and end-alls, right? And we have to remember that as a movement. Now, if you are measuring so many things that it's kind of getting in the way of you actually being able to do what you need to do, then you might need to kind of consider, well, what are the main metrics we need to be measuring here? What are the best indicators of our success? And can we just measure those? But there's kind of different stages to this as well. When you're early on, you might want to measure more things, so you can kind of identify what are the best metrics. So one example that I got from somebody working on deworming, actually, was if they had tablets there for deworming on the day at the school that they were kind of like handing these tablets out, that was a very good indicator that the children would actually like be dewormed the next day. So like that was kind of like an easy light touch thing that they learned was a very good indicator over time. In a similar way, I think you can kind of start a bit more heavy touch perhaps and work towards finding those indicators that really help you to kind of narrow in without having to have like the labor of measuring everything all the time.
Thanks. Could you mention one surprising thing that you've learned about M&E during your time with the Fish Welfare Initiative?
Yeah. I think in some places for us just how kind of like bad my intuition has been assessing what would be a good idea and what would not be a good idea. So we started early on like building our welfare standard from just kind of like literature. We were just going, okay, you know, this is the most theoretically important thing for fish. Roughly we can see that that seems to be a problem, so we'll just fix it, right? And so many things broke down along that path. Like the farmers didn't want to implement, it was way too complicated. We couldn't find good ways of measuring those because like our tools for measuring it were off, right? So we had our data collectors going into the field, we didn't have good data collection protocols, and so like there was a lot of discrepancy in the data, and like a bunch of the data that we've taken is not actually that useful. And I think these things exist in projects that are more like meta, right? There's these complications, but they can be harder to see. And that's like a real dangerous thing, is kind of thinking that like a project is like simpler just because it's easier to, or it's harder to measure rather. So yeah, I guess unintuitive things like that can be quite fiddly.
We have another question referring to what you already said. Do you work with farmers to measure the oxygen density in the water?
Yeah,
and other indicators as well.
Yeah, I didn't talk much about Fish Welfare Initiative in this. So yeah, we work with around 60 farmers at this point. And what we are doing is we're going to those ponds every 2 weeks, and we give the farmer water quality advice, essentially. So we measure the water quality, we look at how we think it's infringing on welfare, and the farmer is essentially signed up to agree, yeah, if you take my water quality measurements, I will like keep a stocking density cap on like how many fish I have per acre in my pond, and I will like try my best to implement the improvements that you've suggested. Now, farmers find that valuable because they like water quality data, because it ties to health as much as it ties to welfare. And so they're interested in kind of learning more about their pond, and they're willing to kind of take the sacrifice of a stocking density cap for that. So at the moment, that's what our project is. Now, as I say, I'm working on version 2 right now, because what we found is that like very heavy touch process is really hard to scale, right? So in part, this was a project in kind of learning more. We wanted to go to the farms regularly just to kind of access more data about like what's going on in these ponds, what are the big welfare problems. We think that we have a decent sense now, and we've kind of conducted that needs assessment, if you like. But it's really heavy touch, and also it's about treatment and not prevention, right? We're seeing problems, and then we're trying to address those problems. We want to move more towards preventing. So, I mean, I'm kind of getting off the actual question. Yes, we go to the ponds every 2 weeks. We measure dissolved oxygen, pH, primary productivity, a bunch of different welfare indicators around water quality. But the hope is that, in the same way as what I was talking about, just we can kind of hone in on a few things that actually really matter and measure those and kind of give advice on those and kind of scale up to something that like farmers can implement as a prevention rather than a treatment.
Okay. For the broader animal movement, what would you say the next steps are for M&E?
Yeah. So I think implementing this is a tricky thing, and we should not expect that we're going to be able to do this well if we haven't been doing it before, right? There's a reason why there's an international community around monitoring and evaluation. It's because it's sometimes it's really hard, and it's hard to get right. So I think real good next steps, as up there, is to consider talking to some people in the community. Again, I'm definitely not an expert, and so kind of talking to some of those experts can help to illuminate whether this is something that's worth your time, and I can help put you in contact with those. More broadly, I think the next step should be that we kind of try it out, and we might not kind of have the optimal system straight away. We might struggle to kind of understand all of the little details about how to implement this, but if we kind of work perhaps in a working group or something like that together, I think that we can kind of figure this out and find how to kind of fit it into the different types of projects that we run in the movement.
Are you sharing your results from M&E? Although, I have a comment here. Although results may vary for different areas and countries, insight into other organization results might help organization if they wish to increase focus on marine animal welfare.
Yes, yeah, I would absolutely love to share that data with you, and we will. So as I say, my plan right now is to write a report on this at the end of this year, talking about what we've done. Now, it's going to be kind of messy. These things are always more messy, right? Like systematic processes like that, where we kind of outline things very cleanly, don't actually tend to reflect reality. So I don't know, I would not be surprised if I write this report and 5 years down the line, I'm watching this on YouTube or something, and I'm like, oh gosh, he did not know how to write a good report, right? But I'll learn it. We'll all learn it. If we think that it's worth doing, we'll learn it. And yeah, I'll definitely be sharing that data towards the end of this year.
Okay, we have, okay. Is better welfare for fish an effective way to reduce people's consumption of fish? How would you monitor and evaluate that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, right? So this is kind of getting at part of what I was talking about with what's the potential for this in the movement. I think that it's easy to conflate different objectives as achieving the same thing. That's not necessarily the case, right? So it's not necessarily the case that improving the lives of fish right now leads to the end of animal agriculture. And I think that's something that we should talk more about, right? Especially kind of with the rise of interest in short feedback loop improvements, things like cage-free campaigning. If your intention is to kind of lead towards the abolition of the animal agriculture in general, then we need to properly assess whether that's actually happening through those objectives, right? And there are ways that we can start to get at that, right? We can see how corporate campaigning is changing behavior change. And we can think about the different steps, right? The assumption, because there is a plausible theory of change there. I'm definitely not saying that. And it's a theory of change that I believe in to an extent. But I think that it's currently somewhat untested. And we need to kind of define that better. So I guess a succinct answer is I think there's a plausible theory of change as to how welfare improvements lead to kind of more consumer compassion, which leads to more awareness around animal welfare issues, which kind of reduces production or consumption and thus production overall. There's a plausible theory of change there. It is currently still a theory. It is not, I think, proven, and I'm excited to work towards making that better known overall.
Another interesting question. Is there a way to compare welfare of fish with, for example, welfare of chicken in a battery cage? And if there is, how do you do that?
That is an interesting question. So this is kind of I think one of the really good examples of how we're a young movement. In a lot of ways, we don't even know how to measure what we're trying to achieve when we're trying to improve the lives of animals, right? We can't talk to them. I hope that's not news to anybody. And trying to measure the impact that we're actually having then needs creativity, right? Generally, we're doing that through indicators, right? What's the mortality what's cortisol or glucose, which are kind of biological indicators. You can look in the bloodstream of fish and see if they're stressed through cortisol. But these things are complicated, right? Cortisol is also triggered when fish are excited. Same with humans, right? So we don't have perfect ways of even just measuring what's the effect on that animal, let alone how can we measure it against other animals. And yet, that's a really important question, right? If you're trying to choose how can I have the most impact, especially if you're looking in the short term, being able to measure animal welfare, it's just a fundamental part of that, right? So we kind of have to work with what we've got to a degree, but we also need to kind of acknowledge the barriers as to what we have. So ways that I think people tend to do this is kind of through formed intuition, right? We kind of look at the situation that battery cage hens are, broilers are, fish in India, fish in Kenya, wherever. And we tried to kind of draw from like the literature or from kind of like an evaluation of the needs of those fish, who's suffering the most. But that is just a god-awful system, really, if we want to get down to it. I think there's possibilities for us to do better, but they're quite complicated and they're quite difficult and they're quite untested, you know. So for example, we can kind of look at the indicators of welfare and try to quantify in some way how much it's impacting the lives of those fish, right? So say I have a DO, a dissolved oxygen level of like 2 milligrams per liter, which is pretty low. We don't like that. Then we might say, okay, well, what's the cortisol level when that happens? What's the mortality rates when that happens? What's the disease rates when that happens, right? All these indicators of welfare. And then we can kind of compile those into like a quantifiable metric based on like how much of those stress responses being triggered by that input, right? So we take kind of DO as our input, these welfare problems as our outputs, and we can kind of look at it like that and say, okay, can we quantify that? And there are like quantifiable ways of doing that, right? Using statistics, but like that's making a bunch of assumptions about how welfare works, right? Like, is it the case that welfare is like as simple as inputs, outputs, and it's just a hidden latent variable in the middle between those? Probably not, no. So sorry for not giving you a succinct answer to that, but it's a really complex problem. It's a very interesting problem. It's one that our movement needs to solve if we're going to get to the places we want to be and properly assessing what's worth doing and what's not worth doing. But right now, we only have bad answers. And we can work with that. You know, I think we have to work with that to a degree, but we also need to consider how we can answer that question better in the future.
One more on measurement.
Please.
Can you measure the effectiveness of implementing an M&E process?
Mm-hmm. I did think about making this talk, like the example theory of change is like my theory of change of giving this talk. I thought that would be kind of interesting and meta, but then I thought maybe I should pick something that actually applies to people and isn't just kind of about me. Yeah, so I think that you can evaluate that to a degree, right? I think that you can look at kind of like the outcomes that you're getting. And I would, in fact, encourage you to do this, right? Again, I have talked a lot about how great I think this is, right? But I have only been doing this for like a year and a half. I'm still learning about it. I don't really know fully how it applies to the animal movement. And so I think whilst you're applying these, you should be looking at the outcomes that you're getting and thinking like, okay, is Tom actually right? Is this actually worth the time that I'm investing in doing this right now? There's a decent chance that the answer is no. And actually, we're doing pretty well with our intuition, or actually, these things are just really hard to measure anyway. We're not getting much further with like trying to do this in a systematic way, or talking to M&E experts. They all end up just being kind of shills or something like that. I don't know. Whatever it is. So yeah, I think you can measure it to a degree. I think you should measure it where you can.
Okay. I have one more question. Do you think it makes sense, and how would you go about kind of evaluating the effectiveness or impact of an intervention that at the beginning you weren't thinking about monitoring and you don't have the metrics, but you started it kind of as on an intuition, and in retrospect you want to check if it's doing, but you don't have the metric defined. How would you go about it? Yeah,
so as I kind of said, like maybe I was a little too hard. Successes in the pre-plan, that might be a little too far. You can succeed and not do it in the pre-planning stage, right? And I think it's just kind of like it's the same process, really. It's just kind of like you're thinking through something that you're already doing to a degree, right? And that's okay, right? Like I don't think that that's a problem. And we can kind of like work together to define like what one might do to measure what you are doing. And again, don't get too caught up in let the kind of like the perfect be the enemy of the good here. Just finding like some metrics and putting that into a system is a good start. If you're not already doing that, just trying to do that, like take an hour out of your day and just see if you can like come up with like a rough theory of change, some rough assumptions that you're making, and brainstorm some ways that you could measure that, and just see if there's something worth doing there. Would be kind of my advice. Yeah, so don't stress. It shouldn't. It's a it's here to help us, not to hinder us. So don't get too stressed about it.
Okay. Thank you very much. These were all questions. Give it up for Thomas.